I think, to teach and disseminate good policies. And that's partly about evidence-based policy, as was discussed. But I think it's also about the design of institutions and also what I would call strategy. Okay? So what do I mean by that?
喺睇片之前，大家記得分享、讚好同訂閱卓見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁你就唔會錯過我哋嘅最新影片。
So what I'm going to do and what I was tasked to do in my half-hour speech was to talk a little bit about my own kind of personal perspective on, what a school of governance might be about and what might it teach and what might it achieve. But I have to say, when the proceedings started, I thought oh my gosh, am I going to talk about something crazy? But then with Mr. Zhao's talk and Professor Wong's presentation, I feel a bit calmer now. Because I think what I have to say resonates very much with your presentations. Okay, but this is just a very idiosyncratic, personalized view about governance and what is governance. Okay, so let me just sort of say as motivation, how do we motivate a school of governance? Well, my own personal motivation for thinking about governance is really this picture. This is a picture I've been obsessed with probably since I was an undergraduate student at the London School of Economics, and I read Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and I got the question into my head of where did capitalism come from and why does it thrive in some places and not other places? I don't know why I put all of this stuff at the bottom here, just to look serious. But here is, what my colleague at the University of Chicago, the historian Kenneth Pomerantz, labeled the Great Divergence, this enormous divergence in living standards that we've seen in the world over the past 200 years, this is the past 170 years, the enormous divergence between sub-Saharan Africa, the United States, Western Europe. I put Hong Kong up there, because it's such a spectacular case of catch-up. And of course, the East Asia and China that I'll talk a little bit about, even though I'm not terribly competent to talk about East Asia and China. But I didn't think this is a moment to talk about Africa, although I'll be very happy to if anyone gives me a chance. Okay, so here's the motivation. Right? So what lies behind that? Okay, well, I think different choices lie behind that picture. Okay, different societies made different choices. That's what most of my work has been about politics and institutions and how different societies create different types of institutions with enormous consequences for economic development. Now, public finance economics has traditionally studied policies, but it's typically focused on describing optimal policies to deal with various types of issues. Okay? And when I think about the word governance, I think of something different from public finance. I think governance is much more a positive theory of why countries choose the policies that they do. And of course, if you look at that picture and you think that picture is explained by different societies making different choices, then not everybody's making good choices for whatever reason that may be. There's a lot of bad choices. Public finance economists don't study bad choices. They study and characterize good choices. But governance is about good choices, and it's about bad choices and about the circumstances that lead to one or the other. Okay, so let me start with, the study of why policies which are agreed to enhance efficiency are or are not adopted. Okay, so economists characterize policies that promote efficiency. Why are they not adopted? Let me give you an example that I can keep coming back to, which is economic openness. Right? So here's some long-run data on exports as a share of national income. Okay? So many Latin American countries, we have Argentina and Brazil here, have for many years followed a policy which led the share of exports in national income to contract. But what we know about the current period of economic growth, the current period of economic growth since the Second World War, is that economic success is highly associated with openness, with increasing the share of exports in national income. So there's South Korea. You can see that this process of economic takeoff in South Korea since the 1960s, highly associated with exporting and openness. Hong Kong, even more dramatic, of course, historically very open to the world. But that openness is, I would say, a choice. That's a choice. It's a choice that Brazil and Argentina made to be closed, and it's a choice that South Korea and Hong Kong made to be open. Okay, so economists, we know that international trade is good for economic growth, specialization, and this is just a very robust finding about economic success and economic failure in the contemporary period. Okay, so let me talk about maybe an even more difficult question about policies which are undesirable. I'm going to talk about how we characterize desirable and undesirable. But, here's an even more visceral case of undesirable policies being adopted. I didn't think this was going to turn out to be quite as large as it is. Okay, and I'll come back to the rationalization of this. It doesn't have, Hong Kong up there. But anyway, okay, you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so if we're talking about why desirable policies, do or do not get adopted, or why undesirable policies do or not get adopted, there's a sort of list of candidate explanations that you might start with, which I call the 3 I's: ideas, interests, and institutions. Okay, so let me run through some examples in this context. What about ideas? Okay, well, if I was going to think about the origin of the closed economy model in Brazil and Argentina, I might start with this pamphlet on the right-hand side from 1950, which was written by Raul Prebisch in Chile, The Economic Development of Latin America and Its Principal Problems. This was the sort of founding document in what became known as dependency theory, which basically said that engaging with the international economy was going to impoverish Latin American countries, and they had to adopt a closed economy model, okay, the so-called import substitution. There's different ways you could think about that, but one way is certainly from perspective of ideas, okay? If I thought about South Korea, I don't have such a good Hong Kong example, but if I thought about this export trajectory in South Korea, this is a photograph from President Park's museum in Seoul of him shaking hands with the winner of the 1977 kind of export competition. This was the $10 billion export day, 1977, celebrating the success of exports. So President Park was deeply convinced, actually he was obsessed is the word, with exporting. He was deeply convinced that exporting was the secret to economic success in South Korea for reasons, I'll come back to this later on, for reasons that have little to do with economic theory, actually, but he wasn't wrong. But here he was, celebrating Export Day. So this was also about ideas and the kind of vision of what how South Korea could be successful. What about President Trump and his reciprocal tariff calculations? Well, I put here the mysterious formula. I'm not going to go into the details of the algebra. The mysterious formula which was offered by his economic advisors to justify the tariff rate, which was mysterious, let me just say. Okay, so here's an example of ideas. Maybe difficult to grasp, but there is an idea here. Okay, even if it's difficult to grasp, as I said. Okay, so And I want to say, you know, and I think that's actually reflected in the agenda here, is that, you know, I think ideas are important. I'm going to give a couple of really personal examples of, I think, how important ideas are. But I think ideas, you know, social science is much too materialist in my experience, and ideas are important in lots of different ways. This is a famous quote from John Maynard Keynes's General Theory, you know, where he talks about the ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they are right and when they are wrong, and we're talking about right and wrong now, are more powerful than is commonly understood. Okay, so this is a very famous quote about how ideas are more important than interests. Okay, and here's a couple of very personal examples. So this is the current Prime Minister of Greece, Mr. Kyriakos Mitsotakis. And I met him for the first time before he was Prime Minister, when he was Minister of Administrative Reform. So after the crisis, he was brought in to help restructure the government. And he was an undergraduate in social studies at Harvard University. And he said to me, I asked him, I was teaching at Harvard at the time, and I asked him, you know, what did you learn at Harvard that was useful in your current role? And he said, I read Max Weber's Economy and Society. He said, and you think that's too abstract and too useful for a job like restructuring the Greek state. But he said, it's incredibly useful for me because it gives me a goal. Weber characterized, you know, modernity as this transition from a patrimonial organization of authority to a rational legal authority. And that's exactly what we need to do in Greece, he said. So there's an idea. You read Weber's Economy and Society, you know, you might not think, how on earth can that be useful to somebody reorganizing the Greek state? It turned out to be very useful. He said, you have to know where you're going, okay? And that helps me understand where I'm going. Here's another example of a very fun character, Mart La, who, I don't know if you know who this gentleman is, who I met at a conference at the OECD in Paris many years ago. He was basically the first prime minister in Estonia after the transition from socialism. So I met him, and I was just over coffee, and I started asking him, how did you decide what to do? You know, you had to reform so many things. How did you prioritize? He said, oh, we had no idea what to do. But I had a copy of Milton Friedman's Capitalism. What's it called? He said, Milton Friedman, that was our Bible. It gave us a checklist. And I said, isn't that absurdly kind of abstract and ideal? And he said, yes. But he said something almost similar to the Greek prime minister, which is we had to know where we're going. We had to have a target for where, you know, we didn't know what we could achieve, but we had to have a target for where we were going to go. And Milton Friedman provided a target for where we want to go. So I think these are just kind of very quotidian examples, but they're just very, to me, they were very striking of the power of like ideas. You know, leave aside interests and institutions I'm coming to, but ideas are important also in understanding where to go. Okay, so Capitalism and Freedom, that's the book. Okay, so what about interests? Well, you know, economics is a lot of it is about interests, and again, I'm quoting here too many words on this slide from a very fine book by the economic historian Carlos Diaz Alejandro, the Essays on the Economic History of the Argentine Republic, where he addresses the question of, you know, why did Argentina adopt this disastrous policy of kind of closing the economy? And his explanation is in terms not of ideas, not of this intellectual innovation of dependency theory, but in terms of interests, you know, and he says the main problem arises in that the policies which are best from the viewpoint of economic efficiency, free or nearly free trade, generate an income distribution favorable to the owners of the most abundant factor of production. That's classic international trade theory, and therefore strengthen the position of the traditional elite. So his explanation is it was the rise of a counter-elite political coalition with the Juan Perón in the 1940s that basically was the death knell of free trade in Argentina, because free trade benefited Perón's political opponents. So he closed the economy for these reasons. So this is an interest-based explanation for those facts I showed you, okay? And of course, institutions are important too. So institutions are important for lots of reasons, but perhaps just for the sake of today, think of institutions as being important because they aggregate ideas and they aggregate interests. They help determine what ideas come to the top or what interests are powerful. In particular, here's an example from James Madison's Federalist 51, his famous discussion of the institutional organization of the US Constitution, where he says, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. I'll come back to that. But then he goes on to emphasize how you have to structure institutions so that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. What did he mean by that? He meant there are vested interests, but if you pit one interest against another interest, that can work out for the benefit of society. You can kind of nullify the interests by setting up this competition between the interests. So you structure institutions so that vested interests can be consistent with the collective welfare. So think of institutions as aggregating ideas and interests. Okay, so ideas, interests, and institutions thought of in a particular way. Okay, so what's the role from this perspective, from my very personal perspective of a school of governance and policy? Well, obviously, I'm suggesting to try to think about, to do research on, to teach what are the factors that lie behind the formulation and adoption of bad policies. And when good policies are or are not adopted, we have a lot of wisdom in public finance and political economy about this, but there's a lot to learn, okay? I think to teach and disseminate good policies, and that's partly about evidence-based policy, as was discussed, but I think it's also about the design of institutions and also what I would call strategy, okay? So what do I mean by that? Well, whoops, I need to press the right button. I want to say real-world politics is not just about taking ideas and taking interests and taking institutions as given. It's also about recombining them. It's about building coalitions. It's about persuading people of what's in their interest. And here's one way of thinking about that. This is a diagram I like very much. It's from a famous book about the diffusion of innovation, but it's very useful in talking about politics and governance as well, which is that when it comes to implementing policy or changing policy, it's very difficult to keep everyone happy. Policies are rarely Pareto improving in a technical sense of making everybody better off. And this diagram provides a nice way of thinking about that, okay? It's very helpful for thinking about faculty meetings also. So there's the innovators. There's the early adopters, the people who drank the Kool-Aid, okay? They're all gung-ho. There's the early majority. Okay, people are in favor. There's the late majority, can be persuaded, dubious, skeptical. And then there's the laggards. There's some people who will never be persuaded that having a school of governance is a good idea. Okay? So this is a way of thinking about who and how you build a coalition with, and in what sequence you build a coalition, you know. And so I'm going to say a few things now. I'm going to restrict myself to 3 things because I don't have enough time. And this is something I feel very passionate about because I think there's a lot of folk wisdom in economics and political science about things like this, but it's rarely articulated or talked about, okay? So let me just sketch 3 ideas. So the first thing, you know, is try not to create losers. Okay? Wonderful example of that, of course, is the Chinese reform. My former colleague Yingyi Qian, of course, has a beautiful book about how reform worked in China, where one of his themes is the design of reform in China was such as to avoid making losers. Creating losers. That's the common theme in his book. Of course, there were some losers, probably the Gang of Four counts as losers. I'm not quite sure how the social planner counted their welfare. But here's Yingyi's a sort of great example I like, which is looking at the first period of reform between 1978 and 1988. And he points out that if you look at kind of employment in state-owned industry, it's more or less unchanged. It even goes up a little bit. So there was no mass privatization. People in state-owned enterprises were kind of left alone. They weren't threatened by the transition. But if you look at private employment, non-state employees, it absolutely explodes, okay? So reform was organized to kind of make sure that nobody lost in some sense. That's one of the themes of his book, okay? So that's a principle, that's a very common principle of thinking about reform, okay? Here's another principle, which again, it's not well articulated, but you kind of know it when you see it. And I'm going to return to, I'm going to talk about priorities, and I'm going to return to the Korean case. So last August, I interviewed a gentleman who was a former Minister of Finance in South Korea who was working in the United States as a professor. In the early 1970s, and President Park, no, I'm going to come to that. Sorry, I'm going to talk about export first. I'm sorry, I'm going to come to the gentleman who was called up by President Park. This was another gentleman who was called up by President Park, whose job in the 1970s in the Ministry of Trade was every morning when he came to work to phone all 26 custom houses. I'm sure there's more than 26 custom houses. But in the 1970s, he had to call to every single 20 of the 26 custom houses every morning to find out how much they'd exported yesterday. Okay? Now, no public finance economist would ever think it was interesting to know what had been exported yesterday. But by noon, he had to have a list on President Park's table of how much every single custom house had exported yesterday. Here's a custom house in Gunsan, which is now a museum, one of the custom houses. And I asked him, what happened if it was a good export day? He said, oh, we were so happy. We had a song. We sang the song. Did you have an export song in Hong Kong? They sang the song. And I said, what happened if it was a bad export day? Oh. I had to call up every single person. I had to call up the CEO of Hyundai. I had to call up Samsung. I had to call up Daewoo. I had to ask, why didn't you export yesterday? So this was crazy from a point of view of economics, but it was a fantastic heuristic for getting everybody focused on the task of exporting. And it was a task which had enormous linkages to the rest of the economy. So I think I said priorities. In the case of President Park, it was export, and he came up with a way of focusing everyone's attention on that. This sense of priority is incredibly important, okay? Last one, bit more eccentric, maybe getting more Machiavellian, but I notice this often. This works in faculty meetings as well, by the way. Allow people to take credit for things. Say, who did you give credit to the School of Governance for? Okay. Allow people to take credit. It's hard. It's hard, but it works, okay? My favorite example of this is this is Robert Moses. So you may know the biography of Robert Moses, the man who built New York City, by Robert Caro. And I'm going to not talk about all the things he did, but I'll direct your attention to Jones Beach National Park at the bottom right corner on Long Island there. And when Jones Beach State Park was opened in 1931, Robert Moses had been fighting tooth and nail with Franklin Roosevelt, who was then the governor of New York State. Roosevelt had tried to block the proposal. He just wouldn't give the land, everything. And then Moses invites Roosevelt to the opening and stands up and said, none of this would have been possible without Franklin Roosevelt's support and encouragement and help. And the book has a beautiful depiction of Roosevelt nearly kind of chokes, falls off his chair, of course. But Moses knew how to get people to do what he wanted. Here's Harry Truman. It's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit, Harry Truman said. So just strategy, if you like. There's institutions, there's interests, there's ideas, but the world is dynamic. Interests are constructed in many ways, or people's idea of what their interests are can be changed or can be endogenous, and people's ideas also are not fixed. People can think of the world in different ways. So I think governance is more fluid than just here's people's ideas, here's people's interests, that's it, you know, take it or leave it. No, it doesn't. It's more fluid than that. And I think that's what I wanted to give the sense of by talking a bit about strategy. Okay, my last topic, which I think also fits very well with the discussion, which is especially what the school here can contribute, that I think nobody else is contributing or probably can contribute, which is thinking about the cultural context. So ideas, interests, institutions, but they're all sitting in cultures, okay? And that's, I think, in my experience, that's very important, okay? So think about the three ideas in a cultural context. I mentioned from Federalist 51, Madison's, a dependence on the people is no doubt the primary control on the government. In China, is it? Not if you think today or even historically, okay? I'm getting very pretentious here by quoting Confucius. That's the kind of thing that happens when you get the Nobel Prize. When the way prevails in the world, commoners do not debate matters of government. Okay, now I'm not enough of an expert to know when the way, whether the way does or not prevail in the world, but this is obviously a very different idea of what creates good governance than Madison had in mind. And, you know, how is it then that good governance is achieved? Well, you know, if you read the Analects, at least with an uneducated eye like myself, you're drawn to other discussions of governance where there's a very different concept of how good governance is to be achieved, okay? So these are ideas about how good governance is to be achieved, but they're very different ideas from that prevailing in the kind of Western tradition as summed up by James Madison. Oops. Here's the example that I got out of sync, getting carried away with South Korea. I was interviewing this gentleman who became trying to understand, you know, the implementation of President Park's industrialization, and he told me how President Park had called him up in the United States and said, you have to come back and work at the Korean Development Industry. And he said, the KDI, the Korean Development Institute, which was newly founded in the early 1970s. And he said, I didn't want to come back to Korea. I was having a great time in America. I saw my whole career in the United States. And I said, well, why did you come back? And he said, well, President Park asked me 4 times. And I could say no 3 times. But the 4th time he asked me, I had to say yes. And I resigned and I moved back to Korea. And I said, where does that come from? And he said, from the romance of the 3 kingdoms. And here is the picture that I found in Wikipedia, you know, of a famous incident in the Romance of the 3 Kingdoms where somebody refuses to take over the kingdom 3 times, but on the 4th time, they have to agree. Now, this is just one example. You may think this is crazy, but funnily enough, I spent 2 weeks interviewing many civil servants, and the same story came up on 3 independent occasions from 3 completely different people who had been asked by President Park to do something they didn't want and accept a position in the state. So when I learned this, I said, there's a culture of kind of public service here, which is completely lacking in the Anglo-Saxon tradition, okay? And so this is governance embedded in the cultural context, and of course I could talk about meritocracy, which is, you know, any American professor who's taught Chinese students, you know, or global students knows about that importance of that principle. Okay. And here's my final example, you know, I'm probably even less qualified to talk about the Gulf states than I am about China, but I think this is just such a salient example. If the East Asian experience is salient, the experience of the Gulf states is also incredibly salient, meaning trying to understand the cultural context of institutions. Okay, before I gave you that example from James Madison, the Federalist Papers, but you know, if you try to think about the organization of political institutions in the Gulf states, which is like one of the great development success stories in the last 50 years also, they're absolutist monarchies, Okay, so how is that working? How is that achieving good governance? Okay, here's a quote that I like very much from Sheikh Maktoum, the Emir of Dubai, which is kind of indicative in some sense of the whole philosophy of that transition. My grandfather rode a camel. I don't know if you've seen this before. My grandfather rode a camel. My father rode a camel. I drive a Mercedes. My son drives a Land Rover. His son will drive a Land Rover, but his son will ride a camel. This sort of idea of like the future, here's our patrimony. We have to preserve our patrimony. We have this transitory opportunity to build these societies. How are we going to do that? Very aware of that. Okay, so I think this is just clearly embedded in the culture of the Middle East, of those states, the whole organization of the state, governance, in a way I think that's not well understood. Okay, this is my last slide, I promise. I think, what can you achieve here? I think all of the usual things, social science, rigorous training in social science, policy evaluation, political economy, and strategy, I hope. But what can you do that nobody else does, or I think, or can, is like just start, with my first picture, and I think recognize that the East Asian development experience, setting aside, the United Arab Emirates, has shown that many standard intuitions and generalizations in social science are culturally dependent in ways that were not previously understood. Okay? So for me, how to conceptualize and measure this cultural embeddedness, whether we're talking about ideas, interests, or institutions, there's a lot to understand there, and that's not just important for public policy, but for me, it's one of the most exciting research areas in social science. So I think that really is something that, you can offer, and you get it. Thank you.
中意名家分析，記得俾 like 同埋分享，支持同訂閱卓見名家，最緊要撳埋呢個鐘仔，咁就唔會錯過我哋嘅新片。